Hi, everybody. So, this is Warren Hermans. Welcome to part two of our discussion of what I'm calling the argument from reality. This way of looking at reality is rooted in the broader understanding that I'm calling the cruciform synthesis. This is something that I'm beginning to explain more in different written things or videos, which brings together a way of looking at reality that is comprehensive and also Catholic, that liberates us through accurate knowledge toward the free practice of our faith. And in the previous section, we really fleshed out that understanding of how this understanding is able to unlock our capacity to open our hearts to that real freedom and to practice our faith in a new kind of simplicity that comes after understanding the complexities of what is offered to us in the modern times. And so I want to just highlight a few different points from that may not have been fully emphasized in the first section, while beginning to transition into the meat of this argument and how these arguments kind of nest into each other. So before we kind of dive into those things, I want to highlight that the cruciform synthesis is what we could call a conceptual understanding of the world, but also a concrete one. And this is fitting for any way of philosophizing within the spectrum of Christianity, because Christ is the incarnate Word, the incarnate wisdom of God. And so when we speak about a Christian philosophy, it also should be rooted in this same understanding, that it is rooted in history, rooted in reality, rooted in things that are not merely theories or concepts. I mentioned that this broader synthesis of which this argument that we're going to be building is rooted talks about persons, places, and things in a way that is deeply concrete and lets us come to truly rational and Catholic understandings of these matters and gives us this real picture of reality that unlocks freedom in our faith. The thing that we also want to understand is that this picture of reality centers on the actual historical cross of Christ, that all of these things come into play on the cross of Christ. That is its center and core. And so this is not merely a way of abstractly reflecting about the world, but a way of enthroning Christ at the very center of reality and making him truly as deeply and truly meaningful to philosophical and theoretical reflection as he can be. So that is another piece to this. And another thing to note is that we want to understand this comprehensive understanding of reality as something that is simple. And we mentioned how it really becomes a definition of persons, places, and things. The things chart is what we're going to be talking about in more depth in this video series. But it becomes this true way of looking at these matters. And it's interesting because they also tell you in kindergarten or the early grades what is necessary to make something into a real story. They say that needs to be who, what, why, when, where, who, what, why, when, where, and how, I think. But it gives us these different categories. And so it's very interesting to realize that there are certain parallels between the fact that we are getting essentially who, what, why, when, where, and how, whatever, and person, place, and thing as kind of this fundamental substrate of what we need to know about reality. And seeing that we only get those answers through faith and reason, which we find to coincide with Catholicism, and which enthrones Christ's crucifixion at the center of reality, is the essence of the cruciform synthesis. It's this kind of way of seeing Christ at the center, giving us the reasonable understandings, which then liberate our emotions to the practice of the faith. And so this is kind of this this way that we may conceive of this understanding of reality. And this reality, of course, implies a sacramental character of reality, deeply affirming that all things are reflections of the fingerprints of God, and placing, such an exalted understanding of our Catholic faith. And I want to, before we continue to go deeper in, we mentioned earlier in the previous section that we would see fingerprints of God, in reality. And that's deeply important because we're seeing reality, we're seeing the fingerprints of God in reality, and that's leading us step by step through these arguments. And what we're doing, essentially, is we're also seeing something that's important, which helped me be liberated in the practice of my faith. And I'm just going to highlight this before we dive into the specifics. And what I saw was the logic of the filioque doctrine. And this, if people aren't familiar with the filioque, it's the idea that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And this is a unique doctrine of the Catholic Church over and against the Orthodox Church, which claims that the Holy Spirit proceeds only from the Father. And there's been some people have kind of said that you could say through the Son, but a lot of times the Orthodox really say, no, that's not right. So the thing is that there's this understanding of the filioque, which, I was not a passionate filioquist before looking at this theory, but now I can see that the filioque is, you can see parallels between the filioque and various other processes in the world, various other realities in the world. And this is something else that can be deeply seen in the cruciform synthesis that enables you to say, hey, no, Catholicism seems to be the best description of reality. And that can be a way of going deeper into the embracing of the Catholic faith as the true description of reality. And so this is just another thing that I wanted to draw out before we go into the meat of the approach. And so hopefully, although I'm sharing these bits and pieces, hopefully these are whetting your appetite for what this approach can do for you, rather than merely just confusing you with different data points. But that's what I'm trying to give you reasons to explain why is this so important, and what does this do, and what is this that you're engaging with as you listen to these videos. So without further ado, we're going to introduce the central way of looking at reality. We're going to introduce this central way. And in this approach, this central way of looking at reality is through the metaphor of a book. And a book, I think, is uniquely suited to describing reality because a book creates the necessary metaphorical parallels to a true conception of reality in certain ways. So, for example, there is a way in which every level of a book is, and how like if I have a book, let's just say I'll bring up, here's a Bible. This will be a book. There's a way in which the book truly has, I mean, we can use other books as well. I mean, that's an example. There's a way in which the book reflects the actual structure of reality, and ways that when we philosophize about reality, we're going to have to deal with analogous issues that will be analogous to describing how we understand a book. And so I'm going to describe this to you try to lay this out, because see, in a book, we have pages, we have words, we have sentences, we have pages, and ultimately in those stories we also have characters. So we'll get to that eventually. But we really have words, sentences, and pages. It has a cover. It has a cover. It has a spine. It has a title or a dust jacket. It has, it needs somebody to buy it. It needs somebody to own it. It needs someone to read it. It has to have, in order to get there, maybe it has a bookseller, a clerk in the store, and a cashier. It needs a publishing company. It needs a printing company to actually put it together, and it needs a delivery company to get it there. And it needs an author. It needs editors, and it needs maybe agents to connect, the authors and editors to the publishing company. So there's all these layers that are necessary in this idea of how do these ideas get into my head? How do these words get into my mind? There's all those layers coming down. And these layers are not arbitrary. These layers are showing something about reality. And it's interesting that they coincide pretty precisely. I think they really do a good job of showing that there's this interconnected, multi-layered nature of reality. Because there's a way in which, okay, let's just say that this isn't a Bible. Let's say this is a fictional story. Let's say this is about Batman. And there's a way in which Batman is real. Batman's in the story. But there's a way in which the author of Batman is more real than Batman. And there's something to be said about this, that there's this sense in which there's the story itself, there's the reality that's inside the book. And that's very much like our experience of this world. Is like being in the story. We're the characters in the story. We're the two-dimensional people, so to speak, on the pages. But yet there are these other layers to reality that I believe that we'll be able to show, that these deeper descriptions that go beyond merely the material, that will flesh out these different layers that we need in order to get real conceptions of even understanding the story. Because the thing is, it's almost like what happens is that if we think about the story independent of an author, we start to not really understand what's going on. We start to really, once we don't have a clear conception of all these different layers that I kind of listed out, whether, the cover, the spine and the title, the words, the sentences, and the pages, the buyer, the owner, and the reader, the bookseller, the clerk, and the cashier, the publishing company, the printing company, the delivery company, the author, the editor, and the agent. If we don't have all those layers, if we don't have that full metaphor, we also don't really conceive of the interrelationship of all the levels of reality in a way that enables us to really understand and create precise definitions. And again, the whole point of this is that we're going to see at each step that there is this interplay between faith and reason, and that they're not contradictory. They're not, but they're actually, I think, almost mutually necessary. That you don't end up with reasonable conclusions without faith. And, it's like, and so I think that's a really interesting way this plays out. So, let's kind of see if we can dive in here a little bit more. So let's begin with what you do when you open a book. So we're going to begin this now. We're going to describe what's happening inside the book. And I think that that's probably where we're going to stop in this video. We're going to go through this section on what happens when you begin to think about what's inside the book. And then we're going to move past that. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about the book. So we're going to open up this book and we're going to see, okay, we have pages, we have words, and we have sentences. Now, if we look into a word, an individual word, I'm just going to pick a word here. This is a word from the Bible. I'm not like, so like, let's just take a random word. So the word like inheritance, for example. If you stare at the word from this page in Deuteronomy, the word inheritance, if you break it down like the H, the I, the T, the A, these things really don't mean anything by themselves. And it's interesting because if you look at words in themselves, they don't have meaning because they're made of these letters and it breaks down. The more you stare at a word, the less sense it makes. And, it's the same thing. If I take an object, if I take, let's say I take this relatively not well-made pen. If I you can see it's kind of coming apart, let's say I mess with it a little bit, here's a pen. So let's say if I have a word and the word, I can kind of break it down into letters that don't have meaning. But let's say the pen, I can kind of break this down into like, okay, now we have this little cap thing. We have this little metal thing. Got this tube. Got all these other little pieces and stuff. If I start taking this apart, there's a spring. When does it stop being a pen? Like, this is now, what's this? Is this a pen? So when we break down an object in reality, and that's what we're doing, we're talking about things. We're starting here with things, that things are like words. Things are like the words of reality. When you look at anything, whether it's this folder, whether it's this smashed up pen, it's an object, it's a word. But when you break it down, like, where's the pen? Like, if I take apart all these parts of the pen, Are you going to find the pen there? And this is exactly what Buddhism begins to teach us. It starts to say, okay, the pen doesn't have a self. There's no pen in the pen. It starts to be like, well, how do you know? I mean, is the pen all the things together? I mean, but really, how is there really a pen other than there's a concept of pen? So it starts to make these questions, and it starts to actually make it so that when you look at the object at the level of objects, when you look at the word at the level of words, just like the letters don't mean anything, the parts of the object don't mean anything, and you can't find the object in the parts. It's like it starts to break down. And you end up with this understanding that's just like Buddhism. And Buddhism says nothing has a self. And that's really where you get to. When you stare at words, when you try to understand the book just through the words, you end up with this understanding that there's nothing. The nature of everything is what they would say in Buddhism, shunyata, empty, or anatta, having no self. These are ways that you would get to with Buddhism. But let's take the next thing. So let's say, all right, words didn't seem to get us an answer, or if they did, it became this paradoxical answer. So it's like, okay, well, there's kind of no pen in the pen, but the pen is still here. We don't know how it works. And that's actually how the Lotus Sutra in Buddhism talks about this. The Lotus Sutra says emptiness is indeed form. Form is indeed emptiness. It's kind of settles on this paradox, which is if you want to think, it's really like an incoherent idea. It doesn't actually explain anything. It just says that nothing exists and it's all still here. And that doesn't mean much. Actually, it doesn't give us a real explanation. It can give us a description, but it doesn't give us an explanation. And it's not really what we're looking for here. We're not looking to get caught at that level. And that's not really a criticism as much as it is a description of where Buddhism gets us. And Buddhism gets us to description rather than explanation. So it shows us this problem. We deconstruct things and you end up with can't find the pen in the pen, can't find the word for the letters. You can't make sense of it. So we have to move on to sentences. And sentences are important because sentences give us meaning. And obviously, here we've got, some things from the Old Testament, like it says, the Levitical priests, that is, all the tribe of Levi, shall have no portion or inheritance with Israel. They shall eat offerings. It goes on. They shall eat the offerings by fire to the Lord and his rightful dues. Okay. It gives us a story here. We're getting a sentence here from, this is Deuteronomy 18 we're getting. That's getting us this understanding of what's happening in the scriptures here. And so when you have something like that, you have religions like Judaism, like ancient Judaism, would be reading this and understanding their story. Or if we had a copy of the Quran, you'd have story. It's understood as these religions, like Buddhism is a religion of deconstructing, based on words. Okay, I can't find the actual thing among the letters, so there's nothing. In Judaism and Islam, I mean, mostly modern Judaism and Islam, there's this sense of story. There's this sense of, okay, the thing that matters in the book of reality is the relationships. It's not so much staring at objects and saying, well, I can't find you in your hair, in your eyes, or in this, but it matters who we're related to. It matters, it matters the narrative that we're part of, the story that we're part of. That's the insight of Judaism and Islam, is that understanding of narrative, of story. And their books, their holy books, are narrative. That's what we understand. This is the level of looking at reality from inside reality, which has to do with sentences. You say, okay, there's an actual story being told here. And this is really a very profound and powerful way of looking at reality. And it does a lot of work. And implicit in this understanding, there's this reaching beyond. When you understand that there's a story, you also have in these traditions an understanding that there's an author to the story, and that's grounds. So if we can't find the pen in the pen, we have to ground the whole narrative beyond the narrative. We have to ground the narrative not in the book, not in the words. Okay, I can't find the meaning of the letter, so therefore there's no story. No. It's what's in the author's mind is what's giving grounding to reality. It's like the maker of the pen is the person who said pen. It's not that there's no pen. It's that the pen is made out of stuff, but there's a real maker of pens. And that's the guy who has, makes the pen have some reality to it. It is doing some work here. There's something developing there. You can see how there's something happening with that line of reasoning. It may not be perfect, but that's beginning to reach in that direction. But, there's some problems here, because when you end up in these things, you kind of begin to have this problem. You start to just have a little bit of a challenge here, because you do still have this problem that you can't find the pen in the pen. That's still there. So the stories are still about things that don't exist. You still really have a whole story that is about things that are not really, they don't have, if you're looking at it just from inside reality, you're still kind of like, there's still this element where things don't have personal reality. That's still kind of it's still a philosophical problem that hasn't been resolved. So you have real stories about fake things is a problem, but the real fight, the good ammunition against that is saying, okay, no, there's a God that's grounding this. There's a God that's sustaining this. Things are created by God. That is doing some work, but then we end up with this problem in this paradigm, because we end up with this debate. We end up with this debate between, for example, Judaism and Islam. But well, which God? Is it the God of Israel as described in the Torah? Or is it the God of the Muslims as described in the Quran? And it starts to become an arbitrary debate. It's hard to know. Okay, well, those are both. I mean, if we want to understand creator, sustainer of the universe, these are really good categories that we can use to ground our understanding of reality. But we also end up with this thing of like that there are specific claims that are grounding this argument. And when we can't make a discriminatory judgment, whether it's the Quran or the Torah that we should be following, it undermines our capacity to use those things as a grounding for these deep philosophical problems of words. So we can't know what the real narrative is just from inside, just from like, it's hard to find how do we discriminate what's the true narrative. So we're ultimately unsuccessful in getting out of the paradoxes. And so we kind of almost reach out of it. We kind of reached this almost answer, which was that there was an author of some kind. And we're going to come back to that, because this is really the best answer from within reality itself. But there's certain ways that it falls short. We're going to see why. But what happens is we go from words to sentences. And since when we ultimately fail to fully ground this problem, we end up kind of reverting to the only thing we have left, which is pages. And so pages are really important, because pages are what grounds, the text. And so we could say, like, even if the word isn't real, the page on which it's written is real. And what tradition gives us an understanding of reality that is based on this? And that's Hinduism. Hinduism talks about how everything is consciousness, and that consciousness is God, and that consciousness is your essence. So they would say Atman is one with Brahman. And so the thing is, this is different than Buddhism, which kind of looked at the words and deconstructed them and said there was no self. Hinduism would say, hey, no, don't just look at the words, look at the page. That's the real thing. So there is this element where there's a true self, and that true self is God. And so this is kind of becoming this way of kind of saying, okay, well, if you can't figure out who the true God is as a God that's outside of reality, and you can't figure out what any object is in itself, well, maybe there's this thing that is both you and is reality and is God and is the essence of objects and solves all these problems all at once. And that's what Hinduism claims. That's how it deals with the problems of the ins and outs of reality itself. And that's how it gets there. It says, okay, here's consciousness is everything there is. Consciousness is God. Consciousness is you. And that's how it works. And it actually seems like a really good solution in its own way. It kind of has a good philosophical coherence to it. But there's some problems with this. And so we're going to say also, and this is where the other traditions are going to pipe up, and they're going to say, hey, we're in the world too. And there still are words, and there still are sentences. And they're basically going to say, hey, how do you know that the consciousness that you're experiencing, it feels eternal? You can be aware of your thoughts. You can be aware of things. You can meditate. You can focus. You can do all these things. Let's grant you that you can experience yourself to be not your thoughts, but the awareness of your thoughts. You can experience yourself to realize that you're something more than just your physical body. Okay, we're going to give you that. But how do you know that experience is eternal? They feel eternal, but what if it's not? What if it's something that is also dependent? Like Buddhism talks about dependent co-origination. What if it's something that's dependent on the fact that you ate food? What does anesthesia do to that? I mean, like, if there's anesthesia and you're not aware, does the universe go away? Well, no. So if the universe has some type of being beyond your consciousness, there's something wrong with saying that your consciousness is the ground of all being and that's the way everything is. And there's something is not adding up. There's some distinction between your consciousness and reality. And maybe the sense that your consciousness is really that eternal and that is God, it's maybe flawed. Like it might be flawed in some way, because maybe we can deconstruct that consciousness the same way we deconstructed this pen. Maybe it's based on the fact that you ate today. Maybe it's based. Maybe it's rooted in your brain firing. We can maybe break it apart and not be able to find the true self in that supposed true self that you have, because maybe that true self is also kind of an illusion. And maybe that's what the Buddhists would say, and they actually do have some doctrines like that. So they kind of can make an argument for that. And how are we going to discriminate between those arguments? They seem to have something to say. You can't really know that even though consciousness feels eternal, that it is. So you're kind of, it seemed like a good solution, but that's a fair challenge. And then the Islamic and Judaic traditions will say, okay, well, you might be consciousness. All right, let's grant that you consciousness is there. That seems like a nice philosophical answer you give him. But again, did your consciousness, is it your personal consciousness that originated the whole world? Like, you only existed recently. If it's the net essence of everything, that's kind of odd. You only existed a couple of years. There obviously were people around before you, and so your consciousness is God, and it's the essence of everything. How does that work? And also, they might say things like, "Hey, well, even if you are consciousness, you're still part of a story. That doesn't mean you get to go home and go to your neighbor's house and be somebody else. You are still you. You still are related to certain people. You still belong to a certain country, a certain culture, a certain family, a certain set of relationships. There's still sentences, even if you're trying to say, "Hey, I'm just a page." The Buddhists might say, "Hey, maybe you're just a word." Actually, maybe even your idea that you're a page is a word. And the Judaic and Islamic folks would be like, hey, but actually, you're still part of the story that's on the page. There are still sentences. Even if you think you're the page, don't you have to engage with sentences to some degree? Aren't you still married to this person and not that person? Aren't you? So they'll challenge it like on this. They could challenge it on this practical level. And so there ends up being some paradoxes. And so I think that the thing is that these end up being partial explanations of reality, and they end up kind of engaging with things that are partly true. All of them are capturing partial truths. And the problem is that what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to really try to look at a way that we can have some tiebreakers here. We're ultimately going to look at the tiebreaker of looking at something a little bit more subtle. We're going to go beyond, and I'm not this argument is a developing argument. And I think that we might have to think about why it is that we make this step at this certain point. But the step we're going to make is we're going to talk about characters. And we're going to really talk about the nature of a person. It would be comparable to saying, what can we know about the author of Batman by looking at Batman? That's the thing that we need to do, because we already looked at words. We already looked at sentences. We already looked at pages. But did we dive in and look at character? Do we look at some of these interior dynamics and really figure out what could we find out when we really look more deeply at characters? What can we find out about the author? And that's the way we're going to make this jump from this conflict between this stalemate between Buddhism, the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism and Islam, and Hinduism. The way we're going to make that stalemate from these things of words, sentences, and pages is we're going to talk about character. And when we really go into this understanding of character, we're going to unlock and understand that, hey, the author is not just an author. There's an author, an editor, and an agent. And hey, there's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's where we're going to go. So it's going to break us out from this interior structure of the argument. We're going to come out of that, and we're going to see that way. But the thing that I really want to say before we go there is, how can we, maybe there's some other ways. Maybe we're not really stuck. Maybe we can find a harmony between the between like the Judaism and Islam, the Buddhism and the Hinduism. Maybe we can bring all these together. Maybe there's some way of doing that. So maybe we shouldn't be taking that leap right now. So what we're going to do is before we see that we need to take that leap in order to make sense of reality, we have to really see the last gasps of trying to make sense of reality from inside reality, only from in the story. And we're going to see how that happens. So basically what happens is that if you try, there's three ways you could try to do this. I think that we could say, I want to just see if I want to just check here the way that we do it. The way we would do it is really this. Okay, here we have. All right, so we really have three syntheses that we could try to make from inside the book. And I think that they have kind of a correspondence to those. They kind of, which one are we going to give the most weight to? And I think that the one that gives the most weight to the Buddhist things would be what we would call, and there's some problems with this, it's not perfect, but I think that the New Age synthesis is probably the most word-based or most Buddhist-friendly one. It's kind of like, in the New Age synthesis, there's an understanding where we're taking up some elements of the progress of the West. We're saying, hey, there is some type of an idea like the Abrahamic traditions have of some type of progress of history. That's important. So we're going to take that in from that idea. But we're also going to kind of iron out, and we can kind of say that, hey, maybe the Buddhist statement of no self and the Hindu statement of self, true self, are actually just ways of describing meditative states, and they're just kind of not as different as we might seem. And so we really can just come down to that the thing that matters is this enlightenment, that this experiential enlightenment and this experiential progress is really what we're looking for. We're looking for everybody to get along and everybody to be one. So we want everyone to have oneness with themselves and oneness with each other. And that's the trajectory of individual and collective development. And a lot of the trappings of the outer trappings of the arguments between Buddhism, for example, and Hinduism about the nature of enlightenment, those are just window dressings on the interior growth out of ego, and the ideas about history and the nature of God and these things that might be Western or Abrahamic. These things are just kind of, again, they're the details are window dressing. The thing we really want to understand is that we're moving forward in history, and we could take away, and we can really iron out the differences between traditions. We could say, oh yes, well these, all the wise figures of the world are wise to a degree of enlightenment and transcendence of ego, and the traditions of the world or spiritual traditions are all about it, transcending ego, and let's all just transcend ego and be more one with ourselves and more one with each other, and get rid of the window dressings on all the different traditions and make sure that we don't get caught up on those differences, and instead understand that the essence of what every tradition was really saying was the New Age movement. It really was saying be one with yourself and be one with everybody, and all the religions are going the same way, and let's all just get along. And that's really what it's trying to say. So it irons out the essential messages of all religions and makes them replaced with the message of the New Age, which is this oneness with yourself and this oneness with everybody. And so it kind of irons it all out, but tries to make sense of the world from inside the world. It tries to make those three voices of words, sentences, and pages make a symphony. And that's one way of doing it. But of course, you could see it got rid of the essential elements of all of them. It didn't make a symphony of the actual notes. It made a symphony by getting rid of the primary notes of all of those different things. So it's not, we can't really say that it succeeded in making a symphony of all those things. It made something out of them, but it didn't make something that combined all of them in an orderly way. So it fails as a synthesis. The other thing we could say, this is more on the level of sentences. You can kind of create what we would call the Freemasonic synthesis or the secularist synthesis. And this is the understanding that really what we want is, the details of religions don't really matter, but being a good, virtuous person matters. And so rather than this kind of understanding of, I am God and I'm one with myself and one with God and one with everything, there's a sense of like, hey, there's some type of a God made everything. Some type of a God created the world. It's like a watchmaker. And the best way to live is to live with virtue. And so the thing is, all the religions of the world are really just means of achieving virtue and living in a way that kind of mirrors kind of some of the order of this God who is this watchmaker. And the big truth claims that the religions aren't important. The main thing is that we have to all get along in a secular order, and we can privately hold some details of our own religions. But the big thing is that God made the world somehow. God's kind of a generic God, and we should grow in generic virtue, and we should all get along. The world will be a better place, and we'll end all these wars and conflicts by getting rid of the specific allegiance that we have to the specific details of our tradition. And you can see how this has more of the flavor of a creator that's more like Judaism and Islam. You can see how this is kind of more of the synthesis of all these pieces of information on the level of sentences, just like Islam and Judaism with that emphasis like on the story and the narrative. You could see how it's like that. But the thing really is that, again, you look at it and it doesn't capture the details. I mean, it kind of gets it gives everything into a broader brush that's more like Judaism and Islam. It's because saying there's a creator and there's virtue and those kind of things. But it really, again, it gets rid of the details of everything. It gets rid of everybody's truth claims. It basically says, hey, this thing is really the truth. And so, whereas, this kind of new, so it's kind of like this kind of new spiritual order was claimed in the New Age movement. It's kind of this secular order is claimed as the ultimate authority in the Freemasonic synthesis. So it's like, and that's kind of like, that's also the Freemasonic synthesis. I'm referring to them because the Freemasons have philosophies that kind of resonate with that level, and that's kind of where some of these ideas come from and percolate with, and so on and so forth. So there's that, and so that's really the best way that this kind of comes together. But it still doesn't work. It doesn't work because it still irons out most of the meaning of almost all these things. It's not yet a symphony. It's not really that orderly. It doesn't make sense of this from inside the book. It just kind of smushes it together. The next thing we could do is we can try to make more of a Hindu type of synthesis. The Hindu thing was about how everything was the page, everything was consciousness. And so we could really kind of we kind of had something that kind of had some emphasis on progress, which is the New Age. Then the one that really has that emphasis on progress is kind of the Freemasonic thing. Is kind of, we're gonna have this enlightenment. We're gonna, not enlightenment like they both talk about enlightenment, but this kind of secular progress. We're gonna say, oh yes, reason can solve everything. We're all gonna get along. There's kind of this, there's this sense in which you kind of have these different emphases of how you synthesize these things within the world system without revelation. You can make these different attempts, and you can then attempt the perennial philosophy synthesis. You can attempt this perennial philosophy synthesis, which is to say it's more like the Hindu way of doing it. It's saying, hey, like, let's ditch that progress stuff. Everything is really just about union with God as self. Like, there's not so much about the New Age, not so much we're making a New Age with everybody. It's definitely not so much, hey, we're publicly having a secular order and everyone's growing in virtue. No. It's all about silence. It's all about there is only consciousness. And everything that was really a religious thing that had any external things was just kind of a mistake. And it's all about what we would call the perennial philosophy. And not the perennial philosophy, which is kind of, there's different terms that are used for perennial philosophy, but I'm talking about the perennial philosophy in the terms of like Advaita. In the Hindu tradition, the Sanatana Dharma, this kind of understanding of this kind of perennial wisdom that is an understanding of that there is oneness, and saying that everybody was really saying that to be one. And so you end up, misinterpreting, everything about Judaism becomes about oneness. Everything about Islam becomes about oneness. Everything about Buddhism becomes truncated into the same type of Hinduized oneness kind of a thing. And so it just really comes down to this understanding that everybody is saying, be still, be still. It would be like saying, taking the Psalm saying, be still and know that I am God. It's be still and know that I am God. That's what it'd be saying. That everybody is saying, just realize that you're God. And that's what's going on. There's not this emphasis on social progress of any kind. And that would be, again, it's interesting because you can twist everything to fit that narrative, but you can't really fit everything into the narrative. And that's the problem. The real problem is that no matter what happens, is that you get stuck. And so what we need to do is we need to look beyond these levels of words, of sentences, and pages. And we have to start looking at characters. And by looking at characters, we're going to move beyond. And I think the best attempt was this thing with the author saying, okay, there's something beyond this. But we couldn't figure out, the reason why that couldn't let us get out of this is because we couldn't figure out whether the author was the God of the Quran or the God of the Torah. But now what's going to happen is when we look at the nature of characters in the story, we're going to start to draw some parallels. And that's what's going to allow us to take this leap out of the story and ground ourselves in actually the Christian tradition. And that's what's going to let us move on to saying, okay, wait, we're kind of seeing more of this picture. And when we move past that, we're going to see more of it. And then we're going to say, hey, now we see these things rationally. And hey, this is going to really help us understand where everything is in the universe, and so how everything works and how everything fits together. And that's really going to help us be grounded in the whole Christian tradition. And that's really going to help us a lot with being able to really have a rational basis for our faith. So that's where we're going to leave this video now.